Okay, this is a story about a farmer named Anthony who lived in Russia. He loved turnips so much, he wanted to grow the biggest, most enormous turnip in all of Russia, in all of the world. So the first thing he did was dig a little hole. Can you dig a little hole for me? You can use both hands, there you go. And he planted a turnip seed, and he patted some dirt over it, and he added some water. Shh. And then he waited. And pretty soon, the sun came down. This is the sign language sign for sun. So if you could help me with this, all of you. Little circle and the rays coming down. And then the rain came down. Shh. And Farmer Anthony watered it some more. Can you water it some more? Shh. And pretty soon, that turnip grew and grew and grew. And all of a sudden, little weeds came up. He didn't like those little weeds, so he picked them up. You can help me with this, too. Pop, 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 pop. And that turnip grew and grew and grew. Is it ready to pick yet? No, he wanted the biggest, most enormous turnip in all of Russia. So there was more sun and more rain and more water. Shh. And he picked up those weeds, pop, 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 pop. And that turnip grew and grew and grew. More sun, more rain, more water. Shh. Pick up those weeds, pop, 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 pop. Add a little bit of water. Shh. And that turnip grew and grew and grew. Is it ready yet? Not so sure. Let's put a little more sun and a little more rain and a little more water. Shh. Pick up those weeds, pop, 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 pop. And that turnip grew and grew and grew until it was the biggest, most enormous turnip in all of Russia. Oh, Farmer Anthony was so excited, he couldn't wait to pull that turnip up out of the ground. He grabbed onto the end of that turnip. Why don't we go right over this way, this way. He grabbed onto the end of the turnip, and he pulled, and he pulled, and he pulled, but the turnip didn't come out of the ground. So he sang a little song to help him. You can help him with this. He pulled and he pulled, he pulled and he pulled, he pulled and he pulled, but he couldn't pull the turnip out. No. So Farmer Anthony said, I need some help. Say, I need some help. So he called up, let's see, we need a young lady here. He called up the young lady here. This was his wife. Now his wife was sitting in the kitchen, and she was baking gingerbread. But that's another story. And she came running out to help her husband. And she held on to Farmer Anthony's waist. I know this can be kind of hard, so Farmer Anthony, you face that way, and you held on to his shirt right like that. And Farmer Anthony grabbed onto that turnip, and together they pulled and they pulled, they pulled and they pulled, they pulled and they pulled, but they couldn't pull the turnip out. No. So the farmer's wife said, we need some help.
We need some help.
So they called up the granddaughter, and the granddaughter came up, and let's see, come on up here. The granddaughter came up. And she was glad to help her grandmother and her grandfather. And she put her hands around her grandmother's waist, and her grandmother held on to Farmer Anthony. Farmer Anthony grabbed onto that turnip, and together they pulled and they pulled, they pulled and they pulled, they pulled and they pulled, but they couldn't pull the turnip out. No. So the granddaughter said, we need some help.
We need some help.
And so she called up, should we call up the dog? The dog would help. Where's the dog? Okay, she called up the dog. And the dog came running up. Oops, sorry, there you go. And the dog came running up. And he held on to the granddaughter. Granddaughter held on to grandmother. Grandmother held on to Farmer Anthony. Farmer Anthony grabbed onto that turnip, and together they pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled, but they couldn't pull the turnip out. No. So the dog said, woof. Woof, 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 woof.
Woof, 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 woof.
Which means we need some help. So they called up the cat. And the cat came running up, and she held on to the dog. The dog held on to the granddaughter. Granddaughter held on to grandmother. Grandmother held on to Farmer Anthony. Farmer Anthony grabbed onto that turnip, and together they pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled, but they couldn't pull the turnip out. No. So the cat said, meow, 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 which is we need some help. So they called up the chicken. And the chicken came running up, and she held on to the cat. Cat held on to the dog. Dog held on to granddaughter. Granddaughter held on to grandmother. Grandmother held on to Farmer Anthony. Farmer Anthony grabbed onto that turnip, and together they pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled, but they couldn't pull the turnip out. No. So the chicken said, buck, 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 which means we need some help. So they called up the duck. And the duck held on to the chicken. Chicken held on to the cat. Cat held on to the dog. Dog held on to granddaughter. Granddaughter held on to grandmother. Grandmother held on to Farmer Anthony. And together they pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled, but they couldn't pull the turnip out. No. So the duck said, quack. Quack, 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 quack. Which is we need some help. And so they called up the pig.
Yay!
And the pig held on to the duck. Duck held on to the chicken. Chicken held on to the cat. Cat held on to the dog. Dog held on to granddaughter. Granddaughter held on to her grandmother. Grandmother held on to Farmer Anthony. Farmer Anthony grabbed onto that turnip, and together they pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled, but they couldn't pull the turnip out. No. So the pig said, which is we need some help. Okay. And they called up the mouse. And the mouse held on to the pig. Pig held on to the duck. Duck held on to the chicken. Chicken held on to the cat. Cat held on to the granddaughter. Granddaughter held on to grandmother. Grandmother held on to Farmer Anthony. Farmer Anthony grabbed that turnip, and together they pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled, but they couldn't pull the turnip out. No. So the mouse said, squeak. Squeak, 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 squeak. Which means let's try it again. So they pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled. They pulled and they pulled and they pulled and they pulled. And finally that turnip came up out of the ground. It took all of their help. Come around here. Let's pick up that turnip. It took all of their help to pick that turnip up and put it on the farmer's wagon. They took the turnip home, and that night the farmer's wife made turnip stew. And she made turnip spaghetti and turnip ice cream and turnip shish kebabs and turnip tacos. They had so much tacos, they invited all of the animals to eat with them because they had all worked so hard. And if they haven't finished that turnip, they're still eating turnip to this very day. Take a bow. Oops, sorry. Good job. Okay.